Hello everybody, my name is Santi, and I'm going to go over some of the topics covered in the Week 1 lab for the Codepath Cybersecurity Course. This is going to be pretty simple. All these topics can definitely be covered in more detail, but I'm going to focus on the parts relevant to what we will be doing so that we can understand all the tasks for this week. With that, let's dive into the table of contents. So I've split this up into some sections, and the first one that we're going to start off with is understanding URLs. This is to basically understand what a URL is and how it's used in the internet. Then I'm going to go over get and post requests to understand what it is these requests do. There are several others, but I won't go into those for now. And this is all to set us up for the third section, which is URL manipulation and insecure direct object reference. These are the security related topics, and it's really important we understand the first two sections so that we can understand how an attack like this gets carried off and how we can execute our own. For the fourth section, I'm going to go over some of the tools in the Burp suite proxy that I've used to complete these challenges. And I know it can be a little overwhelming since there's several tools in there, but this is a pretty good base of tools to familiarize yourself with so that we can get started and complete all the challenges for this week. Lastly, I'll show some examples of me using Burp suite proxy. This will include me observing the traffic that I generated when I visited a couple of sites, and also to go over some of the tools that I mentioned in the Intro to Burp suite proxy section. Let's start with URLs. URL stands for Universal Resource Locator. URLs allow us to find resources on a network. We usually call them web pages, but that's not always the case. The internet itself is a bunch of machines on a network that have access to each other's resources. Let's look at the URL I included as an example. As you can see, it consists of several parts. The first white box shows the protocol. The red box shows the domain. The green box shows the method, and the yellow box shows the parameters. Now, by looking at this URL, even if we change the domain, we can pretty much tell that this is going to search for something related to Tiger. Sometimes URLs are a little longer, and that's because in between the red and the green box there might be a bunch of directories that you have to navigate to actually call that function that you want, or to get the file that you want. So you can think of URLs as a path to a file. You can even use your browser to navigate through your local files on your computer. This is pretty much what we do when we surf the web, except the internet has many, many, many files. While we use URLs to navigate through the internet, there are several other things that happen in the background. When we try to navigate to a URL, what we're actually doing is we're making a request to access that resource. There are several types of requests, but for now we just need to know about get and post. Get requests are requests to access data, and we expect to have some data returned to us in the response. One common example is if you've ever downloaded anything off the internet, you are making a get request. Post requests are requests to send data, like when we fill out a form or a survey and submit it. The answers that we fill in is the data that we are sending in that request. When we send a request, what we get in return is called a response. For example, if we were sending a GET request to a publicly accessible resource, maybe like a forum, the response we would get back would have the status code 200 and we'd be able to see all the posts on that forum. Sometimes the response isn't exactly what we want. For example, we tried to do a GET request on a resource that we don't have access to, so either we're not authenticated or we're not authorized to access that resource, we'd probably get a response with the status code in the 400 series and an error message on our screen. One of the things that requests and responses have in common is that they both contain headers. Headers are key value pairs that act as the options to the requests and the responses. They may contain additional information about what we are transmitting or how we are transmitting it. For example, if we wanted to get something returned to us in a JSON format instead of the XML format, we would specify this in the header in our request. Headers can also contain secret keys that would decide whether we're authorized to access that resource or not. Now that we've gone over URLs and requests and headers, we can head on to the more fun part of this overview: URL manipulation and insecure direct object reference, or IDOR for short. URL manipulation is pretty self-explanatory. We just manipulate the URL. So if you remember a couple of slides back, I showed a URL, and the last section was the parameter. If I just manipulate this parameter, or I just write something instead of tiger in the URL address bar at the top of your browser, then I'd get sent to a new result page with whatever parameter I just wrote. Now, what I technically just did was I manipulated the URL. And it was pretty easy to do. Anybody can do that. Now, why exactly is this bad? URLs are meant as ways for users to access resources online. However, sometimes there are some resources that we only want certain users to see. Now, we just went over how easy it is to manipulate a URL. It can become pretty dangerous if you aren't prepared for that. So let's try to think of an example. An example I came up with is, let's say you have a diary and you keep it in your room. Maybe you're okay with anybody entering your room, but you don't want just anybody to read your diary. Let's try to bring it back into the realm of web security and refer to these as sites. So if you're okay with anybody entering your room, the equivalent would be you're okay with anybody accessing www.myroom.site. However, you only want a limited amount of people and people that you trust to be able to read your diary, if any. So you only want a small amount of people to have access to www.myroom.site/mydiary.text. If you don't have a way to verify people trying to access that, then anybody could simply go to www.myroom.site and just add mydiary.text. And the reason that they're able to do this and access it is because you're directly referencing that object. And you're referencing it, as you guessed it, insecurely. The Burp Suite proxy has many tools. It can be a little overwhelming the first time you use it, so we're just going to focus on a subset of those. These are the ones you should probably familiarize yourself with in order to complete all of the Week 1 challenges. The first one is the Intercept tool under the Proxy tab. This tool intercepts requests, which can be modified and then forwarded. Also, remember to turn this off when you first start up Burp, since it's turned on by default. The next one is the History tab under the Proxy. This is where you can observe requests sent and received. By default, this is in ascending order, but I like to switch it to descending order so I can see the most relevant ones at the top, or the most recent ones. Another tool you will find yourself using a lot is the Decoder. This is used to encode and decode strings. There's a nice selection of methods to choose from. And the last one is the Intruder. The Intruder tab has some tools that make brute force attacks easier to do. Positions lets us choose variables to attack, payloads lets us choose what to deliver in our attack, and options can let us add filters to make it easier to search through our results. You'll find yourself using these tools a lot in the following weeks. In a bit, I'll go over some live examples of me using these tools in a similar way to the way you would use them to solve the Week 1 challenges. So now I'm going to go over some of the tools that we use in Burp Suite Proxy, or at least the ones that I feel are most relevant to this week. So after we've already configured Burp Proxy to work with the browser that we want to use, and we start it up, the first thing we should do is turn Intercept off. By default, this is on, and you can find it under Proxy and the Intercept tab. So when this is on, we have to manually approve all the requests that are being sent through the browser. So if I were to click on this link, nothing's going to happen until I manually approve everything. So everything will pop up here, and I'd have to approve. So that can get pretty annoying to do. And this is useful, but I'll go over that use case in a little bit. So let's turn this off for now. Now, all the requests I just approved will start appearing here. And you'll notice this number is high because I've been using this for a while already. By default, this is also set to ascending order. And this is kind of annoying because then you'd have to keep scrolling down to look at the latest results. So I like to send it to descending order, and then the latest results are always at top, and I could just stay up here. So when I click on any of these, I can look at the raw request that was sent. So here I can look at the request itself. But to make some of this easier to read, we can also click on these tabs. So this will let me look at the parameters, or in this case there was just a cookie. So you'll see JSessionID, token, JSessionID 3. And if we were looking at the raw, we could find that here. So these tabs just make it easier to like read the, I guess, the cliff notes of the request. You can click on headers to see the headers. And this is just the hex of the request. We can also click on the response to see what that request gave back, or what we got back when we sent this. This is the status code. So this is 304. If we click on this, oh, this is render. Alright, so this is 200 okay. So 200 is usually very good. That means everything was working correctly. Here we see the raw response that was sent, some HTML. So these two new tabs popped up. So we can look at headers, hex, the HTML. And then when we click render, the Burp Suite proxy will try to render the HTML. For some more complicated sites, this might not load exactly the same as what we would see on our browser. But for securitycodepath.com, it's pretty much always going to look the same. So now let's look at some of the activity we can cause here. So I'm going to click on Paul Bork and show his profile. And I see this, Paul Bork's message, no message sent. Now I navigate back to Burp, and I see this request that was sent. And it's a good thing to note what number you're currently at so you can tell what are the new ones. If we remember, I didn't point it out, but I can point it out now. So before I was at 834, and now I see 835, so I know everything after 834 is like a new request. So now let's say like I take note that this is number 835. I click on Orla Cleary, go back to Burp, and now I see 836. Now I can also notice a pattern that the button is calling this method, and you notice this line doesn't change between these two requests, but something is changing between these two requests. And just to help you guys out, it's this. So this is a post method, and what we're sending in this post request is this data right here. So now I'm going to show you how we can use intercept to sort of play around with this. So let's turn intercept on, and let's look back at these requests. So when we sent it the first time, we clicked on Paul Borkley, we saw this. This is the response we got back. Paul Bork's message, no message set. Then when we clicked it the second time, we clicked on Orla Cleary, and we showed her profile, and we got Orla Cleary's message, as if. Now, let's click on Paul Bork again, and try to show his profile. We have to approve this request, so let's go back to Burp, and we see this. Now, before we approve it, we can modify it. So if we were to change this to Orla Cleary's ID number, which was 5, and then we approve it, even though we clicked on Paul Bork, we should get back Orla Cleary's message. So we forwarded it, and voila, we get Orla Cleary's message. We can also do this another way, using another tool called the repeater. So we would just right click this URL and send to repeater. So now this is if like we know exactly which URL we want to play around with, we could just do this instead of having to manually go back to the browser and trigger it ourselves. So let's click go, and we get a response after we send this. So we see with ID 5, Orla Cleary's message, as if. So now let's change this to 1, and we'll send this request, and we see we get Paul Bork's message, no message set. So this is pretty much what you would use the intercept tool for, or the repeater tool for. The only reason I would ever use intercept above repeater is if I'm expecting some very heavy HTML and Burp isn't displaying it correctly. and that's the only time I would use intercept, just so I could look at the response in the browser where it would display nicely. But let's look at another tool for now. I already typed in a string, so let's just look at this one, but let me start over. So I typed in John. So let's type in Billy this time. So the decoder tool is just a pretty simple set of tools to encode and decode strings. So we could encode this as URL, which would give us this. We could encode it as ASCII2 hex. Could encode it at base 64. Now base 64 is a really common encoding, and that's because it helps take care of special characters. So like if we wanted to save this to a database and we had like a bunch of weird characters in here, in base 64, like none of these are really special characters besides this equal sign, and it's just easier to not have to deal with a potentially like troublesome string that might cause an error. And then we would save this string instead in our database, and we would, when we retrieve it, we would just decode it right here and we'd get it back. Or we could encode it again. So now this is the Billy string encoded once and then encoded twice, and we could just keep going. Another thing we can do with this tool is hash it. We get like a pretty handy selection of hash algorithms. MD5 is a pretty common one. And this is pretty much it for the decoder tool. Like there's also a bunch of online tools you can use instead of this, but if you're already using Burp Proxy, it's just easier to navigate to this and use this. The last one I'm going to talk over is the Intruder tool. So I already sent something here, but let me go back and show you how we would do this. So the Intruder tool basically serves to help automate some of our brute force attacks that we might do. And one thing we could do is after we find the URL that we want to brute force it, we would just right click it and send it to the Intruder. Then this will turn orange. We go here. So here this target already got set up for us. We see positions, and we'll notice these double S symbols. We probably want to clear it since it always wraps around the cookie, unless we want to change one of the cookie parameters each time we attack. But what the S symbols do is they wrap around variables that we'd want to modify each time we send a request. So for this, we don't really want to change anything if we want to brute force attack this to see all the profiles that were available. But what we do want to like modify is this data. So we're gonna click here, add a symbol, and this has to be, the variable has to be wrapped. So we're gonna add another one at the end, and now this symbol is ready for attack. So then we'll navigate to payloads after we've selected the variable that we want to attack. We can click simple list if we have like a list locally that we want to import, or like we want to hand type it out for some reason. But since this is a number, we could click on this and go down to numbers. And then from here we can click sequential or random. Let's do sequential for now. And we can do the starting number, the ending number, and the step. So this is going to send 10 requests, and each request is going to be sending one number, replacing the variable that we wrap. So the first request is going to send 1, second request is going to send 2, all the way up to 10. Now another important thing we want to do is, if this was like a much longer brute force attack, is we want to go to options and we want to make it easier to filter through the results. So if I were to start the attack now, we would only see these fields: error, timeout, length, comment, and these payload status, right? Now that might not be that helpful if we were looking for something else. And here are some common things that we would check for. Or if we know a very specific thing, we could just add it ourselves. So whatever we want to type here, Orla. Oh, let me turn caps lock off. Orla, right? So let's add that. And then we see it appear at the bottom, Orla. Now when I added this automatically checked the flag. But if this wasn't checked, then we wouldn't see these. This flag has to be checked if we want to see all of these as columns, right? So now we could clear all these and just add our own, or we could use these defaults and then add our own to it. But for now, this attack is sort of structured to find out which ID belongs to somebody named Orla, right? So now let's start the attack. And now we see a bunch of other fields populated. All of these pertain to something in this list. So now if we go to the end, we'll see Orla. And we see Orla is checked in 2. She's checked in 5. And she's checked in this one. This one is just the initial one that we sent out, so it's kind of a false alarm. But what we should just be looking at the payload. We see this one, payload 5, Orla. So if we were looking to find which ID belonged to Orla, we would send that request here. This will populate for us, wrap the variable that we want to attack, go to payloads, set up the payload that we want to send with each request, and then we want to make it easier to filter the results, so we just add like something to match in the response. And that's pretty much it for the Intruder tool. I think this wraps it up pretty well, and you could probably imagine many more creative ways to use this. These are all the tools that I feel are the most relevant to this week. This is probably the one you'll be using the most, Proxy HTTP history, sorry. And this is really where it all starts. But I think with this little walkthrough and showcase, you guys are ready to tackle on the challenges. So good luck, everybody.